What is the idea of relative thinking that leads to peace? Hi, I'm Fukuzawa, the best view after reading a book. All of a sudden, have you ever thought, are all human destinies decided? The author of this book says, "It is true that everyone has a certain fate, which Buddha called inen. But on the other hand, Buddha also teaches that there is a way of living in truth that can overcome the fate and get away from suffering. That's because you can understand it if you think about it according to Buddha's relative thinking, that everything in this world consists of a causal relationship between its origin and its effect," the author says. And he also says, this relative thinking is the opposite of the Old Testament and monotheistic absolute thinking, in which everything is determined by God's will. This time, I will introduce you to this book about relative thinking of Buddha, Beyond Absolute Thinking, How Buddha's Relational Perspective Can Save the World, by Isamu Osawa. In this video, I'm going to share two themes from the book. One is that we can overcome our destiny and live a happier life. The second is that as long as we continue to believe in the Old Testament as indispensable and inviolable, there will never be a peaceful world. Please stay with me until the end. Let's start with the first theme, overcoming fate and living happily. Let's start with, in the book, we say, in considering this theme, let's first consider the opposite situation. Take, for example, the case of a highly successful person who falls rapidly. We sometimes hear of people who were once highly successful, such as the president of a large company or a popular entertainer, falling suddenly. Was this their inevitable fate? Osawa says there is another common cause for this. There are many common causes of falling lives. Before the fall begins, your own mind and emotions are acting in a way that brings in negativity. And in addition to changing your own mind, you're ruining your relationships. In other words, it's often the deterioration of your mind and relationships that triggers your fall. He points out that disordered minds and relationships are one of the factors that lead to unhappiness. But if we can get out of our disordered minds and relationships, it's possible to avoid or reduce the misfortune and hardship that fate might have caused us. In many cases, we even get the happiness we didn't want, says the author. On the other hand, however, it is fate that makes it difficult to improve one's mind and relationships, and it is the strong influence of inen that the Buddha spoke of. It says, arguing that the relative thinking of Buddha and Jesus Christ shows us the way out and the way to live. And he takes that from this book and expresses his hope that many people will be happy. Next, let's take a look at the second theme. There will be no world of peace as long as we believe in the Old Testament as an inviolable holy book. The Old Testament was compiled as a holy book of Judaism, which preached the God of creation, and later became a holy book of Christianity, and was deeply involved in the roots of Islam. In other words, the Old Testament is by far the most influential book for mankind. However, according to the book, Mr. Osawa, it is clear to anyone who reads the Gospels of the New Testament that Jesus preached teachings that were completely different from those of the Old Testament. However, regarding how the Old Testament became the absolute holy book of Christianity after the death of Jesus, Mr. Osawa expresses the following opinion. The shock of Jesus being executed and dying caused most of the thousands or even tens of thousands of believers who believed in Jesus as the Messiah to flee. This is because, according to the values of the Jewish society to which Jesus belonged, there could not have been a Messiah without success or victory. Meanwhile, the few remaining followers of Jesus maintained their faith by believing more firmly in the myths surrounding them. Jesus was the Son of God by the Virgin Mary and the Holy Spirit. His death was the sacrifice of God's great love for him to bear the sins of mankind. As a testimony, he was resurrected and reappeared before the apostles. The absolute belief in these myths preserved the faith and carried it through many generations. Thus, the Old Testament became indispensable and inviolable as evidence that Jesus was the Son of God, the author explains. However, scientific advances had led to contradictions in the contents of the Old Testament. Theories that differ from those of the Old Testament, such as the heliocentric theory of the Earth's rotation and the later theory of evolution, have not only been rejected but suppressed. The theory of evolution is still rejected by the Holy See and all Christian organizations, and as a result, about half the people in Christian countries continue to reject it. In other words, In a monotheistic society that claims to be the creator of the heavens and the earth, the strange situation in which the science that uncovers the truth about heaven and earth is not recognized has become the reality of the human world today. Let's turn to modern society. Around the world, many countries such as Russia and China that seek dictatorship and hegemony, called authoritarianism, pose a threat to democracy. The United States, which seems to be a representative democracy, is no longer an exception. Professor Osawa argues, "It is no wonder that in a country like the United States, which used to be considered a leader in democracy, an authoritarian president like President Donald Trump has emerged to divide and distract public opinion. It is a natural phenomenon that has emerged in a country where the majority of public opinion denies science, and it is rather strange that this has never happened before." He says the biggest reason for this is that the Old Testament continues to exist as an absolute authority, like the Constitution, if Jesus' teachings and words are compared to civil law. And a prime example of this is that even if you preach, "All who Jesus takes the sword perish by the sword," you can't even control guns in America. The phrase, "love your enemies," is utterly powerless in the face of absolute Old Testament commandment, an eye for an eye. And I don't want this place to be just a place for denying and criticizing the Old Testament. The relative thinking of Jesus and Buddha more than fills the void left by the Bible and mythology, and leads to happiness and peace. My aim is not to discard or deny the Old Testament altogether, but to free mankind from the authority and mythology brains that exist in it, and to live toward happiness and peace. The book goes beyond denial to the true meaning and value of the 10 Commandments of Moses. That's it for this video. If you want to know more, head over to Amazon and read it. If you're a Kindle member, you can read as much as you want, so it's a great deal. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Please subscribe to the channel and give us a high rating. After reading the book, it was the best view and was Fukuzawa.